At 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. Within the hour, plant director Viktor Brukhanov picked up the phone and filed his official radiation report to Moscow. He reported 3.6 roentgens per hour, a serious but survivable reading. The actual level at the reactor was 15,000 roentgens per hour, a dose lethal in minutes. The dosimeters capable of measuring higher had been locked in a safe because they produced inconvenient numbers. The firefighters who arrived in the following hours were told it was a routine roof fire. They were not told that pieces of the reactor core were scattered across the pavement they were walking on. In the 36 hours after the worst nuclear accident in history, the entire Soviet response apparatus was organized around a single priority, not saving lives, but maintaining the appearance of control. The explosion at Reactor 4 was not a random accident. It was the direct result of a safety test that had been requested by Soviet Energy Ministry officials and deferred for 4 years. The test was designed to determine whether the momentum of a slowing turbine could generate enough electricity to power the reactor's cooling pumps during the critical window between a power loss and the startup of emergency generators, a gap of approximately 75 seconds during which the reactor was vulnerable. The test required reducing reactor power to a specific range. On the night of April 25, an unexpected power demand from the Kiev grid forced the operators to delay the test by 9 hours, holding the reactor at a power level that poisoned the reactor core with xenon-135, a decay product that absorbs neutrons and suppresses reactivity. When the test finally began after midnight, the reactor was in an unstable state its operators did not fully understand. The RBMK reactor design had a critical flaw, known to Soviet physicists and classified, that made it violently unstable at low power. That flaw had never been communicated to the operators managing it. At 1:23:04 a.m., reactor operator Leonid Topchinov pressed the emergency shutdown button, known as AZ5, in an attempt to halt the test. The RBMK's design flaw meant that the descending control rods, before they could dampen reactivity, briefly amplified it. Power spiked to approximately 30,000 megawatts, 10 times the reactor's design maximum, in 3 seconds. The pressure burst the fuel channels. A steam explosion destroyed the reactor core and blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid off the building. A second explosion, the nature of which remains debated, with some physicists arguing it was a nuclear excursion, followed immediately. The graphite moderator ignited. A column of burning debris was thrown 2 kilometers into the night sky. Night shift reactor operator Alexander Akhimov, convinced his instruments were malfunctioning, sent workers into the reactor hall in short-sleeve clothing to manually open water valves. He believed he was managing a coolant line failure. He was sending men into the most radioactive environment in human history. Most of them died within weeks. Plant director Viktor Brukhanov's response to the explosion established the pattern that the Soviet system would follow for weeks. He went to his bunker, assembled the limited information his damaged instruments could provide, and filed a report to Moscow stating that the reactor was intact and that radiation levels were elevated but manageable. He knew, or had reason to know, that neither claim was accurate. His report described damage to the reactor building roof, omitting the fact that the reactor itself no longer existed in any functional sense. The radiation figure of 3.6 roentgens per hour was taken from a dosimeter that could not measure higher. The dosimeters that could measure actual levels were in a locked safe. When one was retrieved and used, it read off scale and was deemed faulty. Brukhanov's report was not simply a panicked underestimate. It was the output of a system in which delivering accurate bad news to Moscow was professionally fatal, and in which officials had developed sophisticated methods for producing documentation that would protect them regardless of what was actually happening. The first emergency call reached the Chernobyl fire station at 1:28 a.m., 5 minutes after the explosion. Major Leonid Telyatnikov led the response, arriving with crews who had been told they were responding to a roof fire at the reactor building. They were not told the reactor had exploded. They were not told about radiation. They wore standard firefighting gear. On the roof above the destroyed reactor, Telyatnikov's men encountered burning graphite pieces of the reactor core, intensely radioactive, scattered across the surface. Some of them picked up the graphite with their bare hands because it was blocking access routes. They began feeling the effects of acute radiation syndrome within hours: metallic taste, nausea, skin reddening, headache. Several vomited during the firefighting operation and continued working. They had received lethal radiation doses within their first hour on the roof. Of the first 134 workers and firefighters who developed acute radiation syndrome, 28 died within months. Telyatnikov survived, losing his hair and suffering severe health consequences for the rest of his life. He later said no one had told them what they were walking into. Pripyat was a city of 49,000 people, a planned Soviet city of wide boulevards, a fairground, a hotel, an amusement park built 3 kilometers from the reactor specifically to house plant workers and their families. On the morning of April 26, Pripyat went about its normal Saturday. Children went to school. Couples were married at the registry office. People walked along the river embankment, visible from which the burning reactor could be seen in the distance. Soviet officials had been told by their own radiation specialists within hours of the explosion that evacuation was immediately necessary. The decision required authorization from Moscow. Moscow required assessment. Assessment required reports. Reports required time. The evacuation of Pripyat was authorized at noon on April 27, 36 hours after the explosion. Residents were told it was temporary, that they should take documents and food for 2 or 3 days. They left pets, photo albums, furniture, entire lives. The evacuation was permanent. Most of them never returned. On May 1, 1986, 5 days after the explosion, Kiev held its annual May Day parade. 500,000 people marched through the streets of a city 300 kilometers south of the reactor. The parade included schoolchildren. Radiation from the damaged reactor had been drifting south, and Kiev's radiation levels were elevated. The Soviet government possessed this information and chose not to act on it publicly. Party officials arranged for their own children to be evacuated from Kiev in the days before the parade. Schoolchildren who marched on May Day were not told why some of their classmates were suddenly absent. The parade lasted hours. It was filmed and broadcast on Soviet television as evidence of normalcy and socialist resilience. Nikita Khrushchev's daughter-in-law, who was living in Kiev at the time, said in a subsequent interview that she had not been told anything unusual about the radiation levels. She marched with her children. She learned the truth later, from foreign news reports. Soviet medical policy in the aftermath of Chernobyl extended the cover-up directly into the healthcare system. Doctors in the affected regions were instructed not to record radiation as a cause of death or illness in medical records. Alternative diagnoses were mandated for conditions that were clearly radiation-induced. The official Soviet death toll from Chernobyl remained at 31 for years, a figure that included only the 2 workers killed in the initial explosion and the 28 who died from acute radiation syndrome within months. Broader health consequences, cancers, thyroid disease, immune disorders, were systematically attributed to other causes or not documented. Liquidators, the approximately 600,000 workers who participated in the cleanup between 1986 and 1990, were given radiation exposure limits that were officially revised upward during the operation to allow them to absorb higher doses without triggering mandatory removal from the site. Many received doses far exceeding even the revised limits. Their medical records were classified. The world learned about Chernobyl not from the Soviet Union but from Sweden. On April 28, 2 days after the explosion, workers at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden began triggering radiation alarms. The contamination was traced to their clothing. Swedish authorities determined the radiation was coming from the east and contacted the Soviet embassy. The Soviets, confronted with evidence they could no longer contain, made their first public acknowledgement, a 20-word bulletin on Soviet state television noting that an accident has occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and that measures are being taken. This was the first information Soviet citizens had received about an explosion that had happened 2 days earlier and that had already contaminated significant portions of Europe. The full extent of the disaster was not disclosed publicly for weeks. Swedish scientists, using their own monitoring data, produced radiation spread models that were more accurate than anything the Soviet government acknowledged. Between 1986 and 1990, approximately 600,000 people participated in the Chernobyl cleanup. Soldiers, miners, construction workers, engineers, and scientists collectively known as liquidators. They built the sarcophagus, the concrete structure entombing the destroyed reactor, in conditions of extraordinary radiation exposure, working in shifts measured in minutes to limit individual doses. Miners tunneled under the reactor by hand to prevent a feared groundwater contamination. Helicopter pilots flew repeated passes over the open reactor core, dropping sand and boron. Many liquidators were not told the actual radiation levels they were receiving. Dosimeters were sometimes withheld, broken, or recorded at lower values than measured to keep workers within official limits. The long-term health consequences for liquidators, elevated rates of cancer, cardiovascular disease, psychological disorders, have been documented in studies by Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian researchers. The Soviet and subsequently Russian governments contested health data that attributed consequences to radiation exposure for decades. Mikhail Gorbachev, in a 2006 essay, wrote that Chernobyl was perhaps the true cause of the Soviet Union's collapse, more than economic failure, more than Afghanistan, more than political reform. The argument is that Chernobyl exposed the Soviet system's fundamental inability to tell the truth, to itself, to its citizens, to the world. The gap between what the government said and what citizens could observe, the burning reactor visible from Pripyat streets, the radiation alarms in Sweden, the children evacuated from Kiev before the May Day parade their parents were told was safe, made the system's claims of authority impossible to sustain. Glasnost, Gorbachev's policy of transparency, was partly a response to Chernobyl, an acknowledgement that the Soviet system could no longer function without some capacity for honest internal communication. The reactor that exploded at 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, was not just a physical structure. It was a pressure vessel for everything the Soviet system had built on the assumption that information could be controlled. The firefighters who walked onto the roof above the destroyed reactor were not told what they were walking into. The residents of Pripyat were told they were leaving for 3 days. The children who marched through Kiev on May Day were not told why some of their classmates were already gone. The system that caused the explosion was the same system that managed the information about it. Subscribe to Operation Redact. The cover-up is always part of the disaster.